I'm just going to shoot from the hip on this bio. Justin is the founder and creator of A Ballsy Sense of Tumor, which is a blog that tackles the issues of testicular cancer. He addresses it in creative and unique ways. Caught my attention, which I'm not saying too much about myself, but that was pretty cool that he did. He has won about 23 WeGo Health Awards, if I'm counting that right. And without further ado, Justin B.
For the record, it is pronounced Berkbickler. Generally, so a little backstory on myself here. I'm originally a 4th grade teacher, and so with a last name like Berkbickler, you get a lot of very interesting iterations on that. And even not even from the kids, just from adults. Like my Scoutmaster, I was an Eagle Scout, and at my Eagle Scout Court of Honor, my Scoutmaster, who had been my Scoutmaster for, 8 years, he's like, I now present to Troop 183's newest Eagle Scout, Justin Burke Bitchler. My grandma and my grandpa were sitting in the front row, and it was a good thing. But I'm here today to talk to you about what I like to call from 2 to 1, a vital mission. And my story starts back in 2016, which I thought was honestly the greatest year of my life. In July, I had just bought a new house and had moved. In August, I started a new job at a new school, and obviously my selfie face was already strong at that point. In September, I run my first Spartan race. I'm not going to say I ran it successfully, but I ran the damn thing. And then in early October, we picked up our new puppy and brought her home, and she's been a terror and a bane of my existence ever since then. But the day that's most important in October came about a week or so after bringing home the puppy, and it's this day, and it was honestly one of the worst days of my life. And I don't mean the fact that I'm wearing the exact same shirt as my boss, that we didn't plan that. But I had, in addition to being a 4th grade teacher, I had just started as a consultant for an educational technology company. And this was the first day that I got to meet my boss, and this was in Tennessee. And my boss, Kentucky, but in my mind they're basically the same thing. I'm from Virginia, it's a thing. My boss lives in Kentucky. And so I asked him, what airport should I fly into? And he's like, well, you can fly into Lexington, or you can fly into Cleveland. And I was like, well, Cleveland's actually in Ohio, or Cincinnati, he said. And so I said, well, I'm going to go with the one that's actually in the state that I'm going to. Turns out, Cincinnati would have been the better choice, because I didn't realize that Kentucky borders Ohio. If you can't tell, I'm not great at geography. So I booked the hotel, I booked the airport, didn't actually look at, and the location, I didn't look at where the 3 of them were in relation to each other on a map until I'm sitting in Dulles International Airport, and I was like, hey, I should figure out where I'm going. Well, Lexington Airport's here, my hotel was here, and the training center was up here. That is not to scale. It was roughly 160 miles round trip. Keep in mind, this was my first event, and I was clearly setting a very good impression. So I panic, and I was like, hey, what should I do? Text him, and he says, just rent a car, make it work. And I was like, it's 160 miles. I'm gonna make it work, but it's gonna suck. So I wake up the next morning at like 4 a.m. and I was like, hey, so far I'm off to a great start. Let's do a self-exam. Because I did those every month, and I figured I was already having a stressful day, so let's make it as stressful as possible. I discovered a lump. And I actually had been doing my self-exams every month since I was 15 or so. And in September, there was no lump there. So I get through the day, even though I'm smiling there, freaking out on the inside. I get home, burn that shirt so I never wear it to the same place again. And I decide I have to call a doctor. It takes me a couple days because, as I said, I had just moved. So I didn't even have a doctor. So not only did I have to locate said doctor, I also had, on the first time of meeting this doctor, asked him, I thought, to grab my balls, which was awkward. So I walk in, the doctor, nurse practitioner comes in, and it's an attractive young blonde woman. And I'm like, awesome! This is gonna get really awkward real fast. I was like, what if, I rise to the occasion? And so I'm like maintaining, and then I'm like, wait, is it more offensive if I don't rise to the occasion? So, needless to say, it's a very clinical setting when someone's checking you in. There was no offense taken, there was no rising of the occasion, but they did detect a mass, and I was like, well, no shit, I told you this without this copay. So I go and I get kicked to an ultrasound. Ultrasound tech, also a woman, she introduces gel into the equation. I was like, this is only getting worse. They detect, yes, there is a mass, and I'm like, okay, again, I told you this a week ago. And then they take me to urologist, and I walk into the urology office, they sit me down, the guy walks in, I was like, finally, a guy's gonna touch me. And then I'm like, ooh. So anyways, he says, there's a mass, and I was like, do you know the other two guys? Because they've just been telling me the same thing. And he's like, and it's testicular cancer. And I was like, well, that one's new. And he said, you're gonna need surgery tomorrow. And I said, it's not gonna work for me. It's Thursday. And he's like, all right, fine, Friday. So I was like, all right. So on Friday, I'm recovering from my orchiectomy, and I'm sitting there kind of wondering, because everything has gone so fast. And in the next couple of days, I had to get scans. I had an x-ray, I had a CT scan, blood work, pretty much everybody, similar story here. And a couple of days later, I'm sitting back in the urologist's office. And at the end of the appointment, I had hobbled out using my cane, lost my thoughts. Because he had told me that the cancer had spread to my lymph nodes and I was going to need chemotherapy. This wasn't my first experience, was my first personal experience with cancer, but my grandfather had cancer, renal cell cancer, a couple years prior to my diagnosis, and he was able to do oral chemo at home. So I was really hoping I could just do the same thing, because he was sick, but he didn't see a lot of things, so I asked, and I said, can I just do that? As many of us know, that's not an option, especially for my particular type. So he said I was going to need intensive chemo. So if you can't tell by my youthful appearance, I am a millennial. So I did what all millennials do, and I took to the internet to try to find what I should expect from chemotherapy. Now, I heard the groans. I actually did find too many horror stories. I actually had a harder time finding resources, a comprehensive account, if you will, from that first day of chemo to ringing the bell to what comes beyond that. And I was very frustrated. And while I was sitting there, I remember I was just kind of journaling my thoughts as of what I was going through. And I realized that I was pissed that I didn't have the resource, but I didn't have to just bemoan that fact, which led me to my first mission. And I wanted to provide a patient-friendly resource for the newly diagnosed, other testicular cancer patients and survivors, and their families. So on my first day of chemo, I quite literally live blogged the entire thing. From when I woke up in the morning, to numbing up my port, to when they hooked me up, to all the different drugs they were putting into me. I literally made the nurse spell check for me. They probably thought I was really weird. I'm now very close friends with a lot of my chemo nurses. But every single moment of that first day of chemo, I wrote up, and that was the very first blog post on what became a ballsy sense of tumor. And I wrote it really up until the last moment of when they unplugged me from the machine, and then that's when all the shitty stuff started setting in. So I voice messaged the rest of it to a woman who was helping me edit, and she typed it up and got it up there for me. So I continued writing. All right, I live blogged the first week. I didn't necessarily talk about every single day, but overall themes from the week. I wrote about major events, such as shaving my head, because there are so many resources out there about women losing their hair to cancer, but we don't necessarily always talk about the effect of men losing their cancer. And there's a whole blog post, I won't get into it, but my hair was very important to me from college, and it still is, and I'm need a haircut right now, so don't look at it too hard right now. But I also wrote about the bad moments, such as when I got through 19 of my 21 treatments without throwing up, and then I made up for those 19 treatments in the span of 5 days. I will say that the best medical advice I can give you is to invest in a Flip-A-Zoo, which is a stuffed animal designed for 8-year-olds. This one is my Pendragon. Turns from a dragon into a panda. That's right. Not only am I a millennial, I'm a very immature millennial. But I also did want to talk about the good moments. This was from treatment number 20, I believe. So this was about a week after I was throwing up, and I was actually feeling pretty good for a couple of reasons. It was a short treatment day, and everything had finally worked itself through my body, and I was near the end. But probably the most important blog post that I felt I wrote in my journey was from this day, which actually wasn't even a blog post because by that point I had no cognitive function whatsoever. So I made a blog instead. So if you go look for the blog post and you're looking for like a really insightful blog post, it doesn't exist, it's a video instead. But it's a blog, you just change one letter. But as I went along through my journey, I was receiving a ton of texts throughout it from my friends, families, loved ones, random people I'd never heard from before. Like my friend Katie, who suddenly became very invested in her husband's balls and insisted on telling me about it. Or my friend John, who never even heard of the concept of a self-exam. Or my friend Brett, who had recently gotten engaged to his boyfriend, and I suggested that they do a self-exam together and kind of make a date night. Luckily, I cropped out when they sent me the video. That was a very awkward video. But their technique, spot on. But I realized that while I had known to do a self-exam, and I did keep up with it, that wasn't the norm. And I'm realizing we're walking in front of me. Which led me to my second mission, to promote conversation about men's health in society through humor, awareness, and education, which it appears that Kyle and I actually have like pretty much the same mission statement. That was not intentional, but he is my other half. Twinsies.
You complete me.
So like I said, prior to my diagnosis, I was in education. I still am in education, but I had a blog. I still use it, well, it still exists. I don't really ever use it anymore because it's not as fun to write about using yoga balls in your classroom as other balls that I write about now. But I wrote a story on there about telling my students, my 4th grade students, that I had cancer, and it kind of went semi-viral, not to the extent of, like a Kiki challenge. But I realized that I could leverage my experience as a blogger and my experience with social media to really, please turn off all cell phones, to leverage my story to make a bigger impact. And as I was doing this, I did some research into the state of men's health. And the Cleveland Clinic found that 52% of men just don't discuss their health with their male friends. 61% of men have neglected visiting a doctor even when they needed to go. I was in that 61% because while I said that I had a hard time going, or I had to find a new doctor, it's not even like before I moved I was regularly seeing a doctor. Prior to 2016, the last time I had seen a doctor was 2014. Ironically, that doctor actually did tell me to do a self-exam. But Mike from the Testicular Cancer Society has also done some research into this, and he found that he asked a bunch of guys, it was a lot of guys as far as I understand, about who's talked to them about testicular cancer. None of the above. And it was teachers, parents, coaches, professors, but the vast majority, no one had talked to them about testicular cancer. And I like to say it was a study, but it was not like an instructional review board. But one of my friends that I taught with asked me, when should a doctor start talking about self-exams? And she has 2 sons, one was 18 at the time, the other one who's 13. I'm thinking she's referring to the one who's 13. Well, I say, he's a little young, but probably in the next couple years. She said, so like when he's 21, I realize now at this point she's talking about her older son who should have already been spoken to this at his annual physicals. So I decided to survey about 500 or so guys at the time. I've left the survey open since then, and found that 78% of guys hadn't been discussed how to do a self-exam at their annual physical. Just out of curiosity, for my own show of hands, before you were diagnosed, how many of you were discussed with your doctor about how to do a testicular self-exam. So a pharmacist and a really scary muscular guy.
He's an Iron Man.
I know, I'm trying not to make too much eye contact. So I realized we have the data to support that this is a huge problem. So I've now made it my mission to talk to guys about testicular cancer and self-exams constantly. These are two examples within the past year. This was when I was in Alcatraz, while I was waiting in the line to get into Alcatraz, I saw a group of 3 Irish guys talking amongst themselves. And I had 2 motivations here. Number one, I just really like Irish accents, so I just wanted to talk to these guys. And number 2, I wanted to tell them the importance of taking care of their own Lucky Charms. So I literally went up to them and I talked to them about it. And maybe it was awkward, but I gave them a business card, which I put a bunch of them out on the tables, but they rolled with it and hopefully it made an impact. Or when I was coming home from a plane ride from somewhere else, this poor guy was sitting next to me, and for like 3 hours, we talked about testicular cancer. He happened to be coming home from visiting a friend who was just diagnosed with testicular cancer, and he had so many questions about how to support his friend, but he also had questions about how to lower his own risk or how to detect it early. So we talked. On the plane ride here, while I was trying to finish these slides, the guy next to me just wanted to keep talking. And I did, because I had a moment to engage with him. I did find that he was in the medical field, so it was kind of a little skewed type thing. But I look for those little interactions. But it's not just me who has taken their experience and leveraged it. I have a series on my blog that I call The Band of Ballers. And you may recognize some of these individuals. I didn't cherry pick these pictures by any stretch of the imagination. But Dave, who you're going to hear a significantly less inspiring speech than this one we're listening to right now, immediately following this. Kyle, Mark, who I want to know what that man's on because he's got a lot of energy, and Mike. These guys have also done it. And it doesn't take rocket science to share your story. I love Kyle's story, how he took his personal and his professional background and put them together to make a difference. But I also do a lot of work with talking with different doctors. Like this is Dr. Charles Maudlin from the Cleveland Clinic, who every year they do an annual mentionance survey. And so I get to talk to him once a year and review the results and say, well, what's the difference? Yes, we've now realized guys don't talk about their health, but why? What can we do to fix that? Or this is Dr. Nussbaum, who just recently did a study about prostate cancer and genetic risk. And it was very, very high level. And I said, this is awesome, and I want to talk about it, but you're going to have to bring it down to like the level of a 4th grader. And he brought it down to like the level of an 11th grade AP chemistry. And I said, okay, now bring it down a little bit. So eventually I understood, but this is going to sound like a humble brag, but I like to think of myself as a rather educated guy. I have a master's degree, I work in education. If I can't understand it, the general person probably can't understand it. So I like to take the good work that doctors are doing, boil it down to what guys need to know, put it in easier terms. There's also a lot of men's health companies out there that need to connect with advocates to the people. This is a kit called the Daddy Kit. How many of us thank sperm before treatment? How many of us thought that was one of the most awkward experiences of your life? I remember going to bank my sperm, and it was like a week after surgery. And I walked into this room that literally thousands of other guys have probably been in, and I couldn't get that out of my head. And I walked in, and they're like, you can choose a movie on the TV. And they walked outside, I'm going through the TV. I look in it, and I picked Desperate Suburban House Moms Part 4. Turn it on. Turn it off about 30 seconds later. I hadn't seen the first 3, so I wasn't understanding the plot. There was key characterization that I had missed. So, what the Daddy Kit does, you collect your sample at home, and you mail it to their lab, they analyze it, they store it. Beyond the uncomfortability factor of going it's super expensive to bank into the traditional setting. It cost me over $2,000 to bank my sperm for 5 years. With the Daddy Kit, it runs less than $600 for 5 years. But they're just kind of starting out. They're FDA approved and anything, but they need help getting out there. And it makes sense to just try that. So I've been working with them to get the word out there. And so for people who are newly diagnosed, this is something I'll recommend to them. And I'll tell them, hey, you know, it's a better experience. It's a heck of a lot less expensive. And I promise that you'll be satisfied in more ways than one. But then also, the Let's Get Checked company is something that I've been working with, and they do at-home blood testing. That you prick your finger, you bleed into a little tube, you mail it off to them. They do PSA tests, they do testosterone tests. I was just talking with somebody last night here, wanting to get their testosterone levels checked, and they were sharing some frustrations about how their doctors weren't explaining it. I've used the Let's Get Checked kit. Super easy, very convenient. And what's nice is their medical team calls you and talks you through all of your response. They are also an Irish-based company, so you get to hear another Irish accent, which is just cool. But the one thing that I've learned most is the importance of humor in talking with men about their health. Guys don't want to lecture. They need important information, but they don't want the lecture. One of the most well-read posts that I have is called 8 Reasons Why One Testicle is Better Than 2. And one reason is self-exams take half as long. But then, so I talk about that, but then I put the information about how to do a self-exam. I say, you're half as likely as getting hit in the nuts. But then I follow that up how trauma doesn't actually cause testicular cancer. I say underwear fits better. And then I found a statistic that said a lot of guys thought tight underwear causes testicular cancer. So by putting in that humor, you engage with people and they're more likely to remember it. Had I walked up to the people in Alcatraz just being like, hey, I want to talk about your balls. Well, I was in San Francisco, so that probably wouldn't have been that out there. But I might have ended up in one of the cells in Alcatraz. And the humor just makes it more apt to have a conversation, better to remember. This was a self-exam infographic that I made. First of all, let's not even focus on the color scheme that I was like married to for 2 years because it's hard to read, but it's very, very clinical and nobody's gonna take the time to read that. Recently, I changed it to this. Again, we're not working on the color scheme, but it's the same exact information with different headings and it gets the message across. But as I'm also talking about humor, there's another part of cancer advocacy that I'm very, very heavily invested in, and it's about being a cancer survivor. This is one of the most jarring pictures that I have, where this was the day they told me I was in remission, and that I was very overweight at that point, to a year later. And I'm smiling in both these pictures, but what you don't see is the inner turmoil that I was going through between those 2 years, or between that 1 year. About 6 months after finishing treatment, I realized that I was slowly sinking into a very deep depression. And this wasn't my first experience with depression because I had gone through a very, very severe depression in high school to the point where I was self-harming and I had suicide ideation. And had I not gotten help in high school, I may not be here today talking with you. But I realized, luckily, because of those, I recognized the signs earlier and I finally talked with my doctor. And I got put on antidepressants and I'm in therapy now. But one thing I realized was we don't necessarily talk about the mental health ramifications of becoming a cancer survivor, which led me to my third and final mission, to portray an open and honest look at what it means to be a cancer survivor. Because, and we've touched on this weekend, how it's a new normal, it's the next chapter. But a lot of shit just happened to you in a very short amount of time. Your body literally tried to kill you. And I didn't have time to process it, I didn't react. So I put that out there. That I was in remission, but now I was taking the time to heal my mind. I was trying different things with different medications. And I found that I wasn't alone. There was a lot of people out there. I mean, let's just do this in the room. Everybody close your eyes so we can have confidentiality unless you don't care. How many of you have had some mental health things since being diagnosed? It's very common. they found that up to 2 in 5 cancer survivors experience PTSD or depression. And that cancer survivors in the United States take medicine for anxiety and depression at twice the rate for people who don't have all these fun mutations and missing body parts. It's a serious problem, and we need to be talking about it a little bit more. This is one area where I don't use a lot of humor because it's a very serious topic. Luckily, the pharmaceutical industry and others are starting to pick up on it. And this is some work that I did with BMS Pharmaceuticals called Survivorship Today. How many of you watched This Is Us? I'm mainly looking at the women in the room here. Or halfway there. I got to sit down and talk with Sterling K. Brown, who was also in Black Panther, if you don't watch This Is Us. He lost an uncle to prostate cancer a couple years ago, so he's very invested in it. What they're doing with their Survivorship Today program is they're talking about the mental health side of things and what comes after your diagnosis, and what comes after ringing the bell, and kind of the unspoken realities of being a cancer survivor. So this is a side passion that I didn't anticipate getting into, but it's something that I now hold very, very near and dear to my heart. But all of these things really came down to one decision. In a nutshell, I decided that I was going to share my story. I honestly spent more time deciding to what I was going to call the blog versus if I was going to share. And as Kenny said, I've won like 1 billion different Waco Health Awards, but this isn't necessarily a humble brag slide, although it totally is, because it's a lot of different cool things that I've gotten to do over the past 3 years. But it all started from choosing to share my story. And here are some things that I've learned that will help you to improve your advocacy efforts, because I hope that we all do share. Sir, I'd like to talk about a self-example. Give me one moment. It sounds super hokey, but starting out by writing a mission statement, which is, my mission statement is literally the 3 different missions of Advocacy. So that helps me hold myself accountable to what I want to get accomplished. Kyle has his for Check 15, but it helps you to stay on target and know what you want to do. Stories and photos are super, super powerful. Your own personal journey, oftentimes, if you look at my Instagram, 98% of the pictures are selfies of me. And 98% of those selfies have the exact same face, because I don't have a very wide range of selfie faces. But I found that if there's a picture of me, and then the important information is in the caption, that's what resonates with people. And the personal stories, connecting stories. So people respond to stories. They don't respond to facts in and of themselves. It's hard to put yourself out there, but you don't want to fear a no. Yes, I've gotten to work with a lot of really cool companies, but for every cool company that I've gotten to work with, there's probably been 16 either outright rejections or just never heard back. Perfect example. I really want to be on Ellen DeGeneres' show, just because I think she's cool, and I think they pay all your expenses to get out there, so that's fine. I have emailed her, not her personally, but her website, every year for the past 3 years, twice a year. In April for Testicular Cancer Awareness Month, and November for No Shave November, because that's how the media works. They like to do those stories in that time. I have never heard back from her, but I already have the email drafted that I'm actually gonna send it like this month, because maybe waiting till November isn't the best idea. But the no doesn't stop me. It's like what Connor said. It's another opportunity, because there's going to be plenty of October or Novembers. There's going to be plenty of Aprils. It's important, and the worst they can do is say no. And as the famous quote says, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott. And it's also really important to not sacrifice the mission for fame or money. And I see this a lot in the cancer community. They start out by sharing their story, and then all of a sudden they're promoting like UPS or U-Haul. I've turned down more abilities to work with different companies than accepted. Like literally earlier this week, a teeth whitening company reached out to me and wanted to pay me a lot of money to promote their product. Sir, I outright said no because the mission is more important to me than the money. Though I do have a mortgage, and I'll put my PayPal information up there in a second.
Did they think you were Kyle?
Yeah, they were like, we want you to make a Check 15 video about it. I was like, wrong guy. And most importantly, remembering why you started. My first mission was to provide the resource for the newly diagnosed. And I have a comprehensive guide that I wrote on the website about what to expect when you're expecting chemo, because it's a one-page thing. And I was recently on Reddit and I saw somebody was asking, they were diagnosed with the same stage as me, about to go through the same thing. I said, hey, this is my experience. I'm not a doctor, but this might be helpful to you, and I put it out there. And someone else who had already read the guide, or his wife had read the guide, said this was really helpful. However, I couldn't read very well while I was going through chemo. And I realized, oh crap, same thing happened to me. So if I'm putting out a guide there that's 3,000 words to a guy who can't read Clifford at the time, it's not going to be very helpful. So I sat in my office in my home for one Saturday and I narrated the entire thing. And so now it's basically an audiobook. But keeping in sight why I started, because it all comes back to wanting to improve outcomes for patients. So everyone here has taken the first step in sharing their story by being here. And I hope that this wasn't just me talking about myself for however long I've been talking for. I hope that you realize that this is just your first step. Sharing your story is important, whether it's on social media or a blog or just to one or two people. It is so important. As my bracelets say, it's important to sack up and speak up. It's hard to talk about your story. It can bring back a lot of things. But it can save a life, and that's what's important. So my final ask here, as we finish up, I would love if we could all join together and spread some light where the sun don't shine. Thank you.